Agreed to. Andrew Little.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I rise to take this call because the ACC scheme is very important to the Labor Party. It has been since its inception nearly 41 years ago. It had a long gestation arising out of the Woodhouse Commission. It was hotly contested and hotly debated. It was supported by the Labor Party in opposition and then the Labor Party in government after the 1972 election, which made some very important changes to make it the scheme that it was when it came into force in 1974. This bill prescribes or creates a process which the corporation can do and the government of the day can do already. There is nothing in this bill that cannot already happen. And if we have a look at Section 6 of the existing legislation of the Accident Compensation Act 2001 and the definition of fully funded, we see that that definition encapsulates the very thing that this bill says it is doing, that it takes into account the fact that the scheme has to be fully funded and defines what that is, and requires the corporation to take into account that there can be fluctuation from one period to the next. And we have this process already when it comes to levy setting that involves the corporation itself, that involves the ministry that gives policy advice, the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment, that involves Treasury, that involves a public process, and then ultimately ends in the Cabinet taking on all that advice and making a decision, reflecting and representing that ACC levies, because they are so widespread and so important to the economy, that a political decision is taken. That's all there at the moment. What this bill does is adds a process whereby the minister gets involved in a preliminary climate setting, if you like, which can happen already and indeed may already do so. The one thing this bill won't do, which is actually the most important, is stop National Party interference in ACC and levy setting, which is the real problem that we are desperately in need of a remedy for. And the Minister's account of the background and the need for this legislation demonstrates the problem. She cannot even give a straight account of the history of the issues behind ACC levy setting today. So let's get it straight. In the 1990s, that national government and the then Minister Bill Birch ran down ACC levies. ACC, under its old pay-as-you-go levy setting process, had built up reserves, as was always intended. You read the Woodhouse report, the late Sir Owen Woodhouse was very clear about the way ACC would operate. It was a social insurance scheme, and the corporation was expected to put aside reserves of levies. They would build it up over time. And that's in fact what happened under successive national and Labor governments. And then the 1990s national government came in. And they never liked ACC. They hated ACC. That's why they ran it down, precipitated a crisis, said this is no good, have to hike the levies, and then they embarked on the campaign to privatise ACC, because that's what national governments do. They don't like social providers. They don't like the state being involved in social provision. And they ran it down, and they mounted the case for privatisation. But it didn't last. And the Labor Party at the time in opposition was very clear that when it took government, it would not accept privatisation, and it would reinstate the corporation as a proper, publicly owned, publicly run corporation, doing what was required to do to prevent accidents and provide a basis to assist people who had been victims of accidents. And then it was fine. And under the Labor government of the 2000s, the corporation went back onto its steady footing. It maintained the levy setting process put in place in 1999 precisely so it could build up reserves. So it maintained the full funding model so it could build up reserves. And its reserves were built up. By the end of that Labor government, it was generating surpluses of around about $1 billion a year. Modest in the scheme of things, but entirely appropriate to ensure some financial certainty and security for the corporation. And then there was a change of government. And then perhaps the biggest economic shock to hit the corporation hit in the form of the then Minister Nick Smith, who could not be relied upon to keep his sticky paws off ACC. So we mounted a silly campaign about crisis. Nick Smith hadn't realised that New Zealand and the rest of the world was going through a thing called the global financial crisis. And it's very interesting, in the Minister's account of the history of the justification of this bill, she never once mentioned the global financial crisis. Well, ACC, as one of the top performing managed funds of the country, suffered the same fate of every other managed fund in the country, privately or publicly managed, and that is their balance sheet took a hit. The valuation of equities took a hit and went down. That was termed by Nick Smith and his National Party counterparts in government as somehow a crisis caused by the previous Labor government. And it wasn't. It was typical National Party rubbish. Nonsense trotted out to justify what they really wanted to do, and that is to hike ACC levies. They either got very poor advice, or the advice they got they didn't listen to, or they just didn't understand. They didn't understand how financial markets worked, which was surprising given the Prime Minister and his background. But anyway, that's what they did. And so they have left, ever since that time, for the last 7 years, ACC levies artificially inflated. Not because it's good for the corporation, but to meet their political agenda. And the truth is, we now know, because we've had the independent research done on it, ACC now over-levying New Zealand businesses and workers to the tune of $350 million. $350 million. And the Minister is uncomfortable because she knows that's right, and she knows she's had advice. She knows she's had advice, and her predecessors have had advice, that they are over-levying New Zealand businesses and New Zealand workers. And she won't do a thing about it. So to give the appearance of doing something, she then contrives this legislation to put in place this extra process so that she can sort of say, oh no, we want stability of levies and we want to make sure we're doing it right. And it's going to take us another 2 years before we start doing the right thing by New Zealand businesses and New Zealand workers. Here's the reality, Mr. Speaker. They could do that now. They could do it now. Reduce ACC levies. ACC is in a very healthy condition, not because of anything that government has done, but because ACC has been very good at retaining outstanding financial managers who've made good investments, wise investments, that have built up the reserves, built up the value of the reserves of ACC to the point where now they are worth over $30 billion. I look at the title of this bill, and it is hard not to break out in a wry smile when you look at a bill called the Financial Responsibility, in part, bill for this government, which, when the work and earners accounts are funded to the tune of 130%, they call it financial responsibility. Well, it is irresponsible to take levies of businesses and workers when you don't need to do so. And then they call it, the other word they describe it as transparency. This from a government who cannot be open and transparent about things like their deal with Sky City over the convention centre. Still cannot be transparent over their deal with a Saudi businessman over flying sheep around the world at New Zealand taxpayers' expense. And they want us to take them seriously? Mr. Speaker, this bill looks like it is doing something that is unnecessary. We will consider this bill in the Select Committee. We will support this bill in its first reading so it can be closely examined in the Select Committee, and New Zealanders can have their say, and the experts can tell us whether this is needed or not. And the experts can come in and say, this government's got their history wrong, we can do this, we don't want to be overpaying our levies, we just want a corporation that can act properly, ideally independently of government, but that it can do the job that it has been doing, which is looking after New Zealand workers' interests when it comes to accidents, New Zealanders' interests when they're in their leisure time and have an accident, levy them fairly, responsibly and properly, not what this government is doing. Let's have a look to see whether this process adds anything. And if we aren't satisfied that it's going to add anything of any value at all, then we won't support it beyond that. Let's have it examined. Let's have it examined. But, Mr. Speaker, we will not support yet another convoluted process to protect this government from the reality of its actions, which is that it is continuing to over-levy and overcharge good businesses and good workers right across New Zealand.